Welcome to this lecture. So for this edition of Insane in the Endgame, I'm Steven Zierk. I'm the GM in residence for St. Louis right now. And in this lecture, I'm going to cover a bishop against knight endgame by my all-time favorite player, Mikhail Tal. And in this game, Tal was black. And as we're going to see, he has the bishop against Smyslov's knight. And so, in this position, right, we start out with bishop and rook against knight and rook. And Tal takes on e1. And so in this position, already, there's actually a very important decision for white to make. And it might seem kind of innocuous, whether we take with the king or the knight. But white already needs to think about how they want to arrange their pieces. So let me ask you guys, which piece would you take back on e1 with? With the king or the knight? And why? So getting a few answers. The knight is correct. And very good, Manny, with the exact reason. So this is the thing. The knight absolutely needs to find a good home. And this knight on c2 is actually very clumsy. Right? These pawns are doing a great job of restricting all the squares it would like to go to. So the correct move for white would have been to take on e1. And now when black moves the king up, the knight immediately jumps to f3. And this knight is going to find a very good home on e5. Had white played this, the knight would have actually been very strong. The knights, more than any other piece, love outposts. They love active squares where they are stable. And this knight on e5 does an excellent job covering the king side, covering the d3 and c4 pawns. And white's king can manage the queen side. So it was paramount. It was crucial for white to activate this knight. Now, when we do this, there's one question we have to check, right? When we bring the knight up like this, we have to ask ourselves, what if black decides to go into a pawn endgame? And if he does, right, what's the result here? And this kind of thing can be tricky to evaluate. So this is why, to understand these more complex endgames, it's actually really important to understand with pawn endgames, right? With simpler positions, the ones you can reach. Because if you can't evaluate this, you can't really evaluate the minor piece endgame. So in this position, we have an equal number of pawns. Black has a queenside majority, white has a kingside majority. The way I would evaluate this position as black, though, is that when we go a6, right, we try to use our queenside majority. White goes a4. And if we want to make a pass pawn on the queenside, either we need to get our king to c6, or we need to sacrifice with b5, which is very dangerous because white gets a passer. So suffice to say, black can't actually do all that much on the queen side. The pawn structure is pretty bad. In the meantime, though, white can make a passer on the king side with h3 and g4. So this position, even without evaluating it exactly, as black, I would be pretty confident here that the only person that could be in trouble is me. If anyone's going to lose this, it's going to be black. And that's really all the information I need. Black can actually, so black can draw if they defend the king side carefully by keeping their king over here. Basically, you keep it in check. I won't go into the exact details. They're not relevant. During a game, I wouldn't think about it at all, whether or not I can draw this as black. But knowing that I can't win this, that's all the information I need to know that taking this is nothing special. And so because of that, whether or not black takes, white's knight can jump in here. And, honestly, this knight, the bishop's a little better than the knight here, for reasons I'll get into. But the knight is such a strong piece there, again, managing, I would say, 75% of the board, or 75% of the files, that it secures a pretty comfortable draw. So, yeah, the best plan for white was to improve the knight immediately, right? Knights need good squares. They need outposts. And this knight on this c2 square, not only is it not good, it's not really near any good squares either. In the game, Smyslov took with the king. And as we're going to see, this one mistake, this one pretty innocuous looking mistake, causes him a world of hurt. In fact, I think it's already either the game-losing move or very close to it. Because now the question is, where is this knight going to go? Tal goes king f8. He's preparing to improve his king, maybe use it on the queen side. And in the meantime, what is white going to do, right? Yeah, Smyslov took with the king, unfortunately for him. If he hadn't, we wouldn't be talking about this game, ironically. But again, we're going to see, it's surprising just how much trouble this gets white into. So in the game, he goes king d2. So perhaps this is why he took with the king. He wanted to cover the queen side as quickly as possible, and underestimated the importance of the knight. Yeah, it may have been time trouble. They hadn't hit move 40 yet. So, but that might be why. He just wanted to bring the king to the queen side to cover these pawns. So the question is, what if Smyslov realizes the importance of this maneuver? What if he realizes just how important it is to improve this knight and goes king f2 now? Right? And sometimes this is a good idea, right? Sometimes if you realize your mistake, it's important, right, to go back and fix it. You know, if this is still a good maneuver, so be it. It doesn't matter if your king just went to e1. But as it turns out, unfortunately for white, it's already too late. Black goes a6 here. And if white goes knight e1, black goes b5. So after knight f3, right, if white insists on this plan, black's gained a couple tempi on the queen side. And these prove to be crucial. Now, let me ask you, how would you play this out as black? Let's say you take. Yeah, this is lost time. And the simplest way, there's a few good ways to play this as black, actually. But the one I like best is you just play b4. The threat is to play a5, a4, and make a passer. If the king goes to the queen side to cover it, something like this. Yeah, right, a5, b4. There's no way for white to make progress. So white's king is perpetually tied down to these pawns. And now black has all the time in the world to break through on the king side. To have any hope of drawing this, white needs to set up a fortress, like this. White tries h3. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, this is actually the wrong maneuver. Sorry, here white does have the fortress. I messed up. No. So this would be good. Sorry, this is good in another line when the position is already opened. King g6. The problem is, let me show you. After h3, if you could already play h4, I'm sorry, you would win. Yeah, you play h5. If black plays h4, you break through. And this is a win, but white plays h4. And this is actually the fortress I was talking about. So the key for black, sorry, is to take on c4. And now you have this open line on the queen side to use. The key is, overall, that these extra tempi are very useful for black. And the queen side situation has changed dramatically. So you take... Sorry, you do have to, yeah, as you just saw, you have to be very careful that you don't miss a fortress. Very, very careful, especially in this position where there's this many locked pawns. Similarly, if white takes and goes knight f3, again, you have to check this endgame. It's worth looking at it for white to see if maybe you can improve the knight this way. But this time, again, black can take. And this time, there's really no hope of a fortress, right? The queen side's wide open. And here, actually, the easiest way for black is you go h5. And now the difference here is, because of these queenside pawns, if white goes h3, let's say white goes h3 and g4 now. Let's say white goes for the same maneuver with this different queenside. How do we win this position as black? What does black do in this pawn endgame now? You have to be a little careful, because let's say if you take and c4, if you just trade off pawns, white takes, and the king is still in the square. The king still covers the pawns. So here white's okay. The key is you want to make a threat with your pawns that white can't answer. And I think you guys are on the right track. You want to make a passed h-pawn. So this time you take, and you go h4. This time, because of the different queenside situation, this g4 is no good for white. Right? Black's pawn goes to h4, and now whatever white does, let's say white tries to push these pawns, now you go c4. And you're going to have a passed d-pawn and a passed h-pawn. White can't stop them both. c4 immediately? In this case, the problem with c4 immediately is white can do something like g5, stabilizing the kingside. And then after c3, white's king is still in the square. So this white could draw. Against a king in particular, you really want these split pawns. You really want the split up passers, because the king can handle one threat easily. When you split up the pawns like this and make two threats, that's how you win the game. Yeah, so again, you have to calculate these things very carefully. That's part of why these endgames are so difficult. But sure enough, this pawn endgame is winning for black. The queenside is too strong. And if white doesn't play g4, if white doesn't do this and let you get the queen, the king marches up, you play c4, you're going to get a monster. So all in all, the overall conclusion from this is it's too late for white to recant his mistake, the bad setup, even if white realizes now that this knight needs to get to e5. Yeah, and as a couple of you mentioned, Smyslov, besides being a world champion, right, is a famed endgame player. And the fact that he made this one natural move that turns out to be a mistake just shows you just how difficult this position is. So Smyslov goes to d2. Right, consistent with his previous move, he wants the queen to guard the the king to guard the queenside, and then he figures as long as he can keep the kingside under wraps, it might be worse. The bishop might be better than the knight, but he can still hold it with a fortress. And we're going to see it takes some absolutely world-class play from Tal to break through this strong idea of Smyslov's. So he goes king e7, white goes knight e1. Right, we're seeing the problem now. This f3 square is unusable. Yeah, so it's kind of funny actually just how clumsy this knight is. Right, it only has two plausible paths, through a3 to b5, which is easily stopped by a6. And since f3 is covered, through g2 to h4. Which is just not that great a square to begin with. So this just goes to show how important it is to recognize the danger early. Because you'd think that this knight would have some way out, right? Some way to get to e5. But these locked pawns, actually, these black pawns do a great job restricting it, along with the bishop. So Tal goes king e7, knight e1, and now a6. So Tal is looking for queenside play now. Right, you have a great position. Yeah, you have a great position, but you actually have to win it, right? You can't just say my bishop's better than the knight. You have to undertake some active play. So Tal is seeking to use his majority. And play b5 and basically start creating threats on the queenside. And here, white has a very difficult decision to make. White can either allow b5, right, after which black can, for instance, target c4 with the bishop, or if white takes, black gets some very mobile pawns, or white can try and prevent b5 with a4. Both of these still leave white in serious trouble. It's doubtful that white could save the game in either case, but all the same, I mean, it's just a difficult decision that Smyslov has to make in the course of the game. So after a3, b5, right, bishop f7 is probably coming next, so at some point this structure comes, and black can look to invade on the a-file with his king. So it's created another weakness. In the game, Smyslov decided to play a4. And at first this looks like a huge mistake. A couple of people have mentioned this actually. a4, at first it might seem like it runs into something, right? Isn't this pawn loose? What if black just plays bishop e8? And here's a question. This very natural looking move, bishop e8, is actually a huge blunder. Anyone see, how does white punish this move? Any ideas? This, you can't save the a pawn, but you can do something very strong here. Yeah, so step one is a5. a5 is very important. You're losing a pawn, but you're doubling black's pawns. So black's pawn structure really hasn't improved at all, right? This extra pawn is worth very little. And after a5, what does white do? The problem is this bishop e8 is actually a tragic mispositioning of the bishop, which means that finally, white gets in knight f3 and knight e5, and the king can manage the a-pawns. Yeah, so this would actually be tragic from black because it lets white fix the earlier blunder. The king can still manage the a-pawns even if there's two of them, and because the bishop has slunk to e8 instead of h5, black hasn't gotten enough on the queen side to justify letting this knight in, and white can draw. So bishop e8 is premature here. Instead, Tal decides to leave the pawn as is for the moment instead of win it, and plays a5. So now white does have king c2, so white's in time to save the pawn. But now it's a perpetual weakness. Why not b5 instead of b takes a5? This is a good question. Bishop e8, a5, if you try to play b5 instead, it's not a bad idea, trying to keep your pawn structure good. But white still goes knight f3. And whether you take on c4 or play b4, again, white gets knight e5 with a complete fortress. Right, the knight covers the c4 pawn and the potential g4 weakness, and black simply has no way in. Yeah, so this endgame is very tricky. And we've seen a couple times already what the potential cost is of a seemingly innocuous mistake. So instead, a5, king c2, and now, with this pawn structure strong, now losing the a4 pawn would be a lot worse for white. So now, actually, only now that he's played a5, now Tal goes bishop e8. The difference being, if white goes knight f3 now, black can take on a4, and he's won a pawn again, but this time the pawn's on b6 instead of a6. And this makes all the difference. Because now he's going to play b5. White doesn't have this defensive fortress he had before. And black's going to have two useful extra pawns on the queen side. So by playing a5 first, black has created a completely different situation on the queen side. So instead, after bishop e8, knight f3 is not good enough anymore. And white has to go king b3. And what do we do here as black? We've drawn the white king to b3. But what is it very important to do right now? Right, yep. Someone pointed out, the bishop goes to c6. Yeah, and this is really a beautiful square for the bishop. Not only does it target the a4 pawn and keep white's king on perpetual defense, but it still takes away the f3 square. I mean, this bishop on c6 is an absolute monster, controlling two of white's pieces. But in spite of all this play, in spite of the masterful piece handling we've seen from Tal, this still is very close to being a draw. Because on the queen side, we have a fortress at the moment. The white king is stuck defending a4, but it's still a fortress. And the king side is very, very close to being a fortress. Right? If black plays h5 and white plays h4, then there's just no way in. It doesn't matter how good black's bishop is if you can't make progress. That would be an example of an endgame fortress. So black must tread carefully. So instead of that, black has one entry to white's position. So first, he aims his king at g4. If the king gets here, white has no kingside defenses, and the king's just going to take all the pawns. So white's forced to play h3. But okay, this is a minor concession, but as we're going to see, it's crucial. Does getting the knight to b5 help anything? It might not be the worst square. The problem is it can't even get to b5. So let's say here, white decides to bring the knight to b5. After knight c2, black goes bishop f3. And after knight a3, again trying to get to b5, there's bishop d1 check already. Right, white can't afford to lose the a4 pawn, so the knight has to come back here. And white still doesn't get to be active. I mean, b5, it's not great. It might be an improvement, certainly over e1. But it's not even in the cards. So Smyslov just keeps biding his time with the king. There's not really anything else he can do. Tal, as I said, brings the king to h5, right, threatening to invade on the king side. And forcing h3. So king g6. And now the next question is, how does black actually make progress here? This is probably, I would say, the trickiest part. Because black's position, right, again, this bishop looks so dominant, but there's no way in at the moment. White's actually established a total barrier. So now we have to figure out, how do we put a crack into white's position? How do we create some pressure? How do we create a new threat that white can't answer? We have to do something here. Zugzwang would be nice. At the moment, it's not realizable because the king is shuffling. All right, yeah, I see it. Yeah, so the key is, white's created this new light square weakness. The king can't get in. The king's locked out, but the bishop can. There's no barrier against the bishop. So first, Tal moves his king out of the way. Then, yeah, as was said, the bishop is actually going to target this pawn. And the bishop is heading over. So for only this, white gets another chance to bring the knight to f3. It looks very strong, but unfortunately, again, it's no longer good enough. And this just goes to show how close this endgame is, because white keeps being inches away from setting up a fortress. This time, after knight f3, black goes bishop h5, knight e5, black checks on d1, king a3, black covers the b6 pawn from knight d7 by playing king e6. And funnily enough, white's about to get in zugzwang. Right, the king is now tied to a4. It has no moves. And if white tries to move the knight around, you just go bishop c2 and h6. And white's completely in zigzag. Right, the knight's tied to this pawn. The king's tied to this pawn. You know, one last thing white can do is g4. But black plays bishop d1. And again, white can't move the king, it drops a4. White can't move the knight, it drops g4. And if white does something on the king side, like this, now black's king is getting in easily. Right, going to take, going to win the h-pawn, and race to glory. So now white can't afford to allow this. And this is why Tal can get away with allowing knight e5. And you can see just how precise he has to be in this endgame. Yeah, just how good this maneuvering is. And for me, this is an extremely borderline endgame that would have been very easy to mess up at various points. And that just goes to show that, despite his reputation as an attacker, which is well-deserved, because he's a monster, just what a clever player Tal also was in the endgame. So after bishop e8, so if knight f3, the black bishop invades here and zigzags white. So instead, he goes to g2. After bishop h5, the knight's not attacked, so white has a tempo to go king c2. Right, just covering this bishop d1 zigzag idea before it can happen. Okay, so no bishop d1, but black executes its original idea, which is to target this h3 weakness. And funnily enough, I mean, this again just goes to show how clumsy the knight is. If we just move the knight to f2, so we're guarding these two light-squared pawns, black could just play king b3, or sorry, white could just play king b3, and everything would be guarded. It would actually be a trivial fortress. And in spite of how passive white is, in spite of the weak light-squared pawns, there would actually be no way in. But the knight on g2 just isn't good enough. Even a knight on f2 would be. So white goes knight e1 and bishop f1. Yeah, so targeting h3, right? Kind of the one weak point that white hasn't been able to manage. So if h4, there's an easy route for the king into the position. Knight f3. And this is a nice try from Smyslov, because now when black takes, white does get knight g5. So white's getting the pawn back, but crucially, what's much more important than the pawn is the fact that black's king now has an inroad. Now there's definitely no fortress. Bishop g2, and white takes on h7. So after bishop e2, couldn't white just play knight h4, f3, g1, and then just shuffle the king? So after knight h4, what's the play? After knight h4, there's bishop f1. And again, black is winning this pawn. So you don't have time. If you could get to g1, maybe you could make a fortress that way, but there's just no time to do it. So instead, white goes for this trade. Knight g5, bishop g2, takes. Here, now the king is getting in though. After king g6, white does have knight f8 and knight d7. This is actually still winning for black after king g4, but Tal didn't want to allow this counterplay. So instead of king g6, he goes king g7. It's more patient, but he's correctly judged. Right? It's a little slower, but he's correctly judged that there's no way for white to prevent this entry, to prevent this invasion of the king. Yeah, now instead white has to go to g5, and the king starts heading for g4. And now Now white's position just has fatal weaknesses. At this point, there's no hope for white to have a fortress. At this point, white might as well go for counterplay, which Smyslov correctly does. So he goes king d2, and Tal goes bishop c6. Right, so Smyslov is saying, I'm willing to give you this pawn after king c1. But Tal actually realizes, if he takes on a4, this lets white's knight get back to e5, which sets up the kingside fortress again. And this is actually winning. At this point, black's improved things enough. Black has the good pawn structure on the queen side. This is actually winning. But again, like that last counterplay I showed you with the knight coming to d7, the same as that case, Tal realizes I don't need to allow this. He's playing this endgame very, very precisely, completely restricting white's counterplay while improving his own position. And he goes back to g2. Another trap to note, if he goes to h5 immediately, right, Tal's on his toes, white has a clever move, knight f7. And again, the king is stopped, because after king g4, white has knight e5, forking the bishop. So here, white would actually get knight e5 in again. And this is still winning for black. At this point, black's position is strong enough that you could get away with this. But all the same, it's good policy, right? Not to allow counterplay, you don't have to. So he goes bishop g2, king up, and king h5. Right? Without the bishop on c6, there would be no fork here. So now the king is invading. At this point, there's nothing white can do to stop that. So Smyslov correctly judges, well, okay, so again, instead of going for a pure defensive play, which might be promising if there were a fortress, if white's fortress were a little stronger, that would have been the way to do it. But here the fortress is clearly breached, and Smyslov correctly goes for counterplay. Knight e6 and knight c7. So the knight's coming to d5, and he wants to start taking these queenside pawns. Right, these pawns worked well with black's bishop. Right, light squared bishop likes having pawns on dark squares. But the one downside, right, one major downside is the bishop can never defend them. So white will start getting these queenside pawns. There's nothing to be done about that. Well, he'll start getting b6, but we'll see. Tal goes bishop c6. And he realizes that even after knight d5, you can't take, because this passed d pawn would be very strong. Right, another pawn endgame that's important to judge correctly. But after king g3, this bishop is very well placed. If white takes on b6, the bishop is perfectly placed to stop future attacks on these pawns. So this was some nice prophylaxis by Tal. So instead of that, so Smyslov goes knight e7, bishop back, knight d5, and he could have taken the pawn immediately. But after takes, bishop e8, white's managed to hold on to this f4 pawn, because after knight d5, black wants to be careful. Black doesn't want to take the knight, because then he'll create this passed d pawn that's very dangerous. But instead he's going to stick to the minor piece endgame and use his a-pawn. So the knight's doing a good job. It's covering f4, but white has two more weaknesses, right? Two more problems in the position. This a-pawn that the king has to deal with now, and this weak d3 pawn. So if white plays passively here, black will just push the a-pawn, and while the king goes and wins it, black will just raid these weak queenside pawns. So again, white can't afford to sit passively. He can't hold the position together. Smyslov realizes this and correctly decides to go for counterplay. So Smyslov goes knight c7, bishop up. Right, the knight's going after c5. It can go two different ways. There's no way to stop them both. So the knight is getting the c5 pawn. And again, you have to judge these things carefully. But as we're going to see, the cost of getting the c-pawn is that white's losing the f-pawn. And again, white has two problems. So after a3, he draws the knight to b3. If white goes with the king instead, black can take, and king e3. And even though white gets material equality, both white's pieces are completely misplaced, and the pawn just runs forward to victory. So instead, after a3, white goes knight b3. So the knight is stopping the a-pawn. But as I mentioned, the knight's been diverted from d5, and that means the f-pawn is a goner. So black goes a2. Again, there's no rush to take the pawn. White has no way to defend it. If white wanted, it could win another pawn. And technically, white retains material equality here. But after knight b3, simplest for black is just bishop up. White has to go knight a1 to keep guarding the pawn. And again, the contrast between pieces and the contrast between pawns is huge. Black just goes king g3. White's knight is tied to this a-pawn. The bishop is still doing a good job controlling white's pawns, and the f-pawn wins the day. So that's the problem, right? These two pawns, fundamentally, cannot both be managed by white. So instead, white sends the king after the a-pawn. Black takes on f4, king b2, and king e3. And kind of similar to the line I mentioned earlier, white's gotten to the a-pawn. White can grab it if they want. But now white's just in no situation to deal with the f-pawn. So one more time, white goes for counterplay. At this point, it's pretty clearly too late. But it's a good try for Smyslov. He goes knight a5. Right, retreat the bishop. And c5. Yeah, so this is a good way of going. I mean, you might as well try for something, right? If the fortress doesn't hold, you need to at least create some threats, or you'll always lose sooner or later. Yeah, there's a few other great endgames like this. Another endgame I highly, highly recommend, that I actually strongly consider doing for today instead, is Fischer-Taimanov. It's bishop and 6 pawns against knight and 6 pawns. And very similar to this, actually. Taimanov had close to a fortress. It looked very hard for Fischer to invade. But Fischer does some brilliant maneuvering, much like Tal in this game, actually, with his bishop and king, and eventually sneaks into black's position by sacrificing his bishop, you know. Yeah, that game's from the Fischer-Taimanov from their candidates quarterfinal. Highly, highly recommend that game if you're looking for another bishop beats knight endgame. Yeah, so in this case, again, jumping back, black has broken down white's fortress. So white tries to go for counterplay with the pawn. And here, Tal actually goes for minimum counterplay. At this point, you realize that you could just go f3. After c7, right, the bishop's a good defender, it covers c8. You just have to check that after knight c4 check, black can go king e2. Right, be a little careful, don't take on d3 and fall for this fork. Although, funnily enough, black's position is so strong that I believe even that may be winning. But okay, so king e2, bishop stops the pawn, this pawn's a queen. I believe that endgame was game 4 of their quarterfinals. Game 2 was another famous bishop versus knight, actually. Fischer had bishop and pawn against knight, and Taimanov blundered a drawn endgame. It's also a good one for study. But game 4, I believe, is the really beautiful Fischer-Taimanov game. But okay, so Smyslov goes for c6. f3 wins, as we discussed. You have to be a little careful. But Tal just takes. And you do want to be careful giving up material. Because you never know. White does stop the f-pawn. It's worth noting, right? The f-pawn's not becoming a queen. So you do want to be careful, right? Evaluating these endgames. Because if it weren't for these pawns, this would actually have been a terrible blunder. But in this case, he goes f2. White has no choice but to give up the knight for this pawn. Check. And king e2. And after white takes on a2, this is another endgame worth knowing. After king e2, if you have the pawn on the fifth like this, on your opponent's half of the board, and you win the pawn in front, it's always winning. So after king e2, black's going to win the pawn, and actually get the queen immediately. So Tal read all of this very well, and actually Smyslov, seeing this, resigned after f2. So yeah, a very, very well played endgame by Tal. Apart from king takes e1, the initial mistake we talked about some, there aren't really any significant blunders, I would say, by Smyslov. He had a couple alternatives, right? A couple slightly different ways he could have defended the position, a3 instead of a4, for instance. But none of them, I think, would have saved the game. So to me, this is a great example of two things, right? Just how good Tal was at the endgame. He has a reputation as an attacker, which is well-deserved, of course. But he was a very, very good all-around player, as you might imagine any world champion is. And the fact that Smyslov, I'd say, who is also an endgame maestro, as a couple of you have mentioned, managed to go wrong with one pretty innocuous-looking move. Shows just how much respect the endgame demands. So all in all, again, this is one of my favorite endgames, because it's just so well played. And it's so borderline, too, between a win and a draw, right? We saw how minor the mistakes from black could have been that would have given white not just a draw, but an easy draw. Yeah, and again, Fischer or Tal in endgame strategy? That's a tough question. They were both absolute monsters. Again, that Fischer-Taimanov game, game 4 of their quarterfinals, is another masterclass that you should look at. Yeah, so next week, I'm going to cover the reverse side of this. I'm actually going to cover knight versus bishop. The famous Karpov-Kasparov game, where Karpov does a pretty beautiful pawn sacrifice. And to win, again, another very, very difficult, very close to drawn endgame of knight against bishop. So I hope to see you all for that next week. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. And thank you all for watching.